I never said I was going to try for a VBAC. Like it was always, I'm having a VBAC. Like I
Hmm.
am preparing for this.
Yeah,
Um,
that language is actually really, really important. That's something that I try to like reiterate to women who are having a VBAC whenever they're like, "Oh, I'm trying for a VBAC. I'm gonna try and see if I can have one." I'm like, "No, no, no. You are having a VBAC. Change
yes.
the language."
Yeah. And I think that was like such a key mindset piece.
Hmm.
And like from the moment I took the pregnancy test and I was pregnant, I was focusing on my mindset.
Hey, you're listening to Births at Home, the podcast with me, Esmeralda, the home birth doula, as your host. I am a mama of three, fellow home birther, and entrepreneur. I am completely obsessed with birth, more specifically, home birth. And this is a podcast where women share their positive home birth stories, as well as the journey that led them down the path to home birth. Whether you're currently pregnant, planning a home birth with your first or fourth baby, or even just someone who is a complete birth nerd like me, this podcast is for you. So grab a cup of coffee and enjoy. We are on episode 16. We will be chatting with Jessica about her three births, one emergency C section in the hospital, and two HBACs. We go into detail of all of her births and we get real and raw and vulnerable. This is a little bit longer of an episode, so I hope you enjoy. Let's bring Jessica on. Hey, Jessica, if you just want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I live in Canada. I live in a small town called Fergus, just about an hour outside of Toronto, with my husband and I have three children. A little bit about me, I'm a complete birth addict, but I am also a business analyst in the corporate life. That's a little bit about me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And so, how did you kind of get into the whole home birth world?
I've always been very intrigued by birth in general. I feel like I can't get my hands on enough birth stories. And when I very first became pregnant with my first, I was very intrigued by home birth. During that pregnancy, I brought the idea up to my husband about having a home birth for our first baby. But he was pretty nervous about the idea and had some anxiety around that. We didn't know anybody who had a home birth. We didn't even know anybody who had midwives as their
Okay.
care providers. So all of our family and close friends were all OBs, often on inductions, lots of C-sections. Um, and that's just what we knew. So it's what we were comfortable with at that time.
Yeah.
I did decide to go with a midwife just because of all the stuff I knew about birth, and I just felt so drawn to midwife care. But we were planning an unmedicated hospital birth for that first birth.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. And how did that one go in the hospital?
So, well, that birth or that pregnancy, I loved being pregnant during that
Hmm.
time. I felt like I was one of those pregnant women who could be pregnant forever. Like I was just in love with it. And at my 40-week midwife appointment, my midwife suggested that I meet our local OB just for a consult in case we needed to have an induction scheduled.
Hmm.
My mom had four babies and she was induced all four times, and both my
Okay.
sisters were induced. So I just kind of, in my mind, assumed I would need to be induced as well. So
Hmm.
I thought it was a good idea to meet the OB just to connect with him.
Yeah.
So I scheduled that appointment for 40 weeks and 3 days. And I went to his office, and it was like night and day different from midwife care. Like usually
Yeah.
I go to my midwife's office and I wait like 5 minutes and then have an hour-long appointment with my midwife versus the OB. I think I waited for 45 minutes in the waiting room for like a 10-minute appointment.
Yeah.
at that appointment, I was like led to the room and given like a gown to like change into, like take my underwear off with the gown. Um, and when the OB came in, he like introduced himself. One of the first things he did was a cervical check, and I
Mhm.
was like 1 centimeter dilated, and I was like ecstatic. Like I was so excited to be
Yeah.
dilated that my body was like doing something, and I didn't know it was. But he was not as excited. He was really stuck on the fact that I was over 40 weeks pregnant.
Mhm.
He let me know that he often induced people at 39 weeks in his hospital. So he pushed to schedule an induction the next day. I tried to negotiate on that timeline, and I really wanted to wait until at least 41 weeks. So I was like, can we schedule the induction for when I'm 41 weeks, which
Mhm.
was the Saturday of that week. And he let me know we don't induce on Saturdays. We're only on call if someone goes into spontaneous labor.
Mhm.
So I left his office a little bit defeated with an induction scheduled the next day. And I just knew in like my core that it wasn't right and I didn't want to be induced. So I
Yeah.
called his office and canceled the induction, which they really pushed to try and have me go because that's what the OB recommended and I was post date, but I didn't want to go for an induction.
Yeah.
So I continued the next few days. I worked out through this whole pregnancy class. I even the day before I went into labor did a Zumba class.
Mhm.
Um, and the night before I went into labor, my husband and I generally would go for a walk. And something in my body just told me to like rest that night. I'm like, I don't want to go for a walk. I just want to go to bed early and relax.
Mhm.
Thank goodness I did because Saturday morning, exactly 41 weeks pregnant, I woke up at 6 a.m. to my water breaking. And it was like a dramatic water breaking. Like I feel like I heard an audible pop.
Yeah.
um, and I jumped out of bed and I was so excited. And we called our midwife, we paged our midwife, and she came to our house, confirmed that it was my water breaking. She let me know that she was at a birth the night before, so she was going to be leaving, but her backup midwife would meet me at the hospital.
Okay.
I hadn't met that backup midwife just because she was recently hired to the
Mm.
practice, but I loved all the other midwives, so I assumed that it would be fine. Our way to the hospital after a few hours, I remember feeling nervous the whole way to the hospital. Like, I feel like my intuition just knew I should be staying home,
Mhm.
but we planned the hospital birth. So we
Yeah.
got to the hospital, we met the midwife, we got all settled in. She let me know that I was having contractions on the monitor, but I wasn't feeling them at that point.
Yeah.
So she let me know that she was going to go back to her clinic and to page her when either my contractions got stronger and I needed labor support, or to page her at pushing if I had an epidural.
Mm.
I felt like it was weird that she was like leaving because I thought she would like stay with us, but I
Yeah.
trusted the process. But as soon as she left, the nurse came in and said she needed to place an IV for my induction. And I was like, oh, I'm not getting an induction. My water broke, like, and I'm having
Yeah.
contractions. And she was just so insistent on placing the IV, it being hospital policy. You know how it goes.
Yeah.
She placed the IV in my wrist, like right where my wrist bends, and it was the most painful IV of my life.
Mhm.
I asked her continuously if she would like change it, but she told me that I had difficult veins, so she couldn't place it anywhere else. And then I just like kind of let it go at that point, and I was squatting on like this little stool, just like completely in my little birth bubble, breathing through my contractions. When the nurse let me know that my contractions weren't strong enough because I was too calm, so she needed to start Pitocin to make my contractions productive. And being a first time mom, I didn't know what contractions were supposed to feel like. So I agreed to Pitocin.
Yeah.
Um, both my sisters had labors that were like over 24 hours. So I assumed my labor would be over 24 hours in my mind.
Mhm.
So she started Pitocin. And as soon as she started the Pitocin, I lost my calm. Like I lost my little bubble. My breath work was gone. It let in my nerves, I think.
Mhm.
Um, and the contractions started ramping up and double peaking to the point where I had very small breaks in between contractions.
Yeah.
I do remember in between like the contractions, even if I had like 30 seconds, I would still mention the IV in my wrist and ask her if she could move it,
Mhm.
which she still did not. And then I felt like I needed to go to the bathroom. So I went to the washroom and I felt so embarrassed for being in the bathroom. I know now looking back that I needed to push, but back then I assumed I needed to go poo.
Yeah.
um, and I remember being on the toilet and I kept trying to stand up to leave the bathroom, but with the contractions double peaking, they kept just like knocking me back down. And I just like wasn't comfortable sitting on the toilet and I didn't
Mhm.
know what was going on. And the nurse came in and said, "You don't seem to be coping well with your contractions. So I think we should do an epidural so you could have a nap."
Mm.
And being that it was only a few hours into my labor and my mindset feeling like I needed to be in labor for another 20 plus hours, I
Yeah.
felt so defeated that I took that epidural because I wanted a nap. I was exhausted already.
Mhm.
As soon as the epidural was placed, it wasn't working properly. Like I still felt all the contractions, yet I was then restricted to being in the bed on my back.
Yeah.
The OB checked, he did a cervical check, and that was the first cervical check since I got to the hospital because I was GBS positive and my water broke. They didn't want to do a cervical check. When he
Yeah.
checked, I was 10 centimeters dilated, and he said, "You're complete and it's time to push." At this time, or I think when the epidural was being placed, my husband called our midwife just for support,
Mhm.
just due to the interactions with the nurse and the OB. The midwife came in just as I was getting starting to push, and the room was filled with so many people. I think like my midwife, her student, the OB student, there was a pediatrician and his student because there was meconium in the water. There was nurses rushing around. So I started to push, um, and the OB was kind of standing in the back of the room, like he was writing down something. I don't know what he was writing. He was charting something. And he said that the baby's heartbeat wasn't handling the pushes. It was having D cells. So we
Mhm.
needed an emergency C-section. And I remember like the room getting so chaotic, but I
Yeah.
couldn't like say anything.
Mhm.
Like at this point, like I needed like a doula to like speak up for me and ask questions or see if we could change positions, go on my side, just the support of that person.
Yeah.
I remember thinking like in like the TVs and movies when you need an emergency C-section, you're like whisked away, like right away. And like, or like they can't even wait to get to the OR. Like you need to get the baby out. But I felt
Yeah.
like it was so slow motion that everybody was like working around me, but I didn't know what was going on. And I was honestly just scared for my baby because they said his heartbeat wasn't handling or wasn't doing well.
Yeah.
At that point, a man like came up with a form for me to sign, and I remember signing it. I think it was like consent to the C-section, and I said to him, "That isn't my signature," because I was so shaky that
Mhm.
like the signature was so wobbly. He's like, "It's okay, we just need something on this form." So we get to the OR eventually. Um, And obviously, I'm panicked and very scared. So the anesthesiologist said, I'm going to give you something to calm you down.
Yeah.
I don't know what he put in the IV, but like it just made me so foggy. Um, I remember back in the labor room, I had like my calm space with like my labor playlist and like essential oils and candles
Mhm.
versus being in the OR. It's like bright and they had like the local radio station on, and I remember being annoyed because Lady Gaga's Just Dance was playing on the radio. And I'm like, what is this song? Like, why is this song playing now? And then my baby was born to that song. And in that moment, like, I don't really remember him being born. Like, I don't remember his first cry. Um, since there was meconium in my water, the pediatrician like took him away to do like an assessment, make sure
Mhm.
he didn't inhale any of it. Um, and honestly, I don't remember meeting my baby for the first time in the OR. I have pictures of him like all swaddled up with like a hat on, like up by my head during the C-section,
Yeah.
but I don't remember that moment.
Mhm.
The first thing I remember post surgery was in like the recovery room, and our midwife like unswaddled him and like put him on my chest. And I knew that I loved him,
Mhm.
but like I couldn't process what happened. I think I was just so like dissociated.
Yeah.
um, I also had an allergic reaction to whatever they gave me in the IV, and I
Mhm.
couldn't stop scratching. I was scratching myself to the point that I was like bleeding.
Oh no.
So they had to give, I guess, an antihistamine to make the reaction stop.
Mhm.
And we just like continued, got back to our postpartum room. I I feel like I didn't really know I had a C-section, even though that seems silly because I just went through it, but I like immediately blocked it from my
Mhm.
mind until the next morning. I wanted to have a shower, and in that hospital, the postpartum rooms don't have a shower. You have to walk down the hall to the labor room. So the nurse was having me walk down to the labor room that I was in the day before to have a
Mhm.
shower. And like that was the moment that it hit me that I had a C-section.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I just like broke down crying because I
Mhm.
wanted an unmedicated birth
Yeah.
and just everything that happened. And I remember thinking in that moment that I was planning future VBACs immediately.
Mhm.
I remember like already knowing that I would not be having another C-section and hopefully not having another birth in a hospital.
Yeah.
So that was kind of like the push towards home birth for me.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, yeah, it was a lot.
Yeah, it was. It sounds like you tried really, really hard to be prepared. And in the end, it's just like, I think the way that we grow up learning about birth and everything, it's so hard to unlearn it. Even
Mhm.
when you are learning about like physiologic birth and everything, it's hard to unlearn everything that you learned before that. So
Yeah,
it's like you know all these new things, but then the doctors start telling you something else that you had known for the whole beginning of your life that
yeah,
you're like, okay, yeah, like you're right. I'm going to believe you and trust what you say.
yeah,
So
they're the professionals.
yeah, it's so hard, especially for first time moms to just like believe in what they learned and not believe in what they grew up learning. So I wish there was like a different birth education system that we all normally grow up with and learn about physiologic birth, not about medicalized birth, because it's so hard to unlearn.
It is. And like
Hmm.
I did feel so prepared. Like I think I was listening to like two or three birth stories a day and like
Hmm.
I was literally looking up birth 24 hours, I swear.
Yeah.
And like
Hmm.
I've watched so many births like videos, and I just love birth. So I just
Mhm.
like felt like I was gonna have the most like zen peaceful birth I could, and it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Um, and I feel like even that postpartum period, I pushed that birth drama so far down inside of myself. Like I knew I just couldn't think about it or process it because I was
Mhm.
a first time mom. Like I was struggling with breastfeeding and just having a newborn baby.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
and that kind of brings me to like my second pregnancy. I found out I was pregnant around my son's first birthday. And I was so excited to be pregnant again. I've always wanted a big family.
Mhm.
But that pregnancy was much harder than my first. My first, I had no morning sickness or heartburn or anything. And my second pregnancy was the opposite. I think I had
Oh,
everything.
no.
um, I remember our very first midwife appointment. I was considering changing providers because of my midwife from my first birth. I felt like she kind of abandoned me
Yeah.
and left me with the medical system, which that wasn't what I wanted.
Mhm.
I interviewed another midwife group, but I just didn't connect with them. I didn't have the feeling. So I went back to the midwife group from my first birth.
Mhm.
And the midwife that attended my first birth was no longer with that practice.
Mhm.
So I felt comfortable again knowing that our midwives work in pods of like 2 or 3 midwives. I
Mhm.
felt comfortable with the 3 or 2 midwives that I would have as my birth team for my VBAC.
Mhm.
And like, I never said I was going to try for a VBAC. Like, it was always, I'm having a VBAC. Like, I am
Mhm.
preparing for this.
Yeah,
Um,
that language is actually really, really important. That's something that I try to, like, reiterate to women who are having a VBAC whenever they're like, "Oh, I'm trying for a VBAC. I'm gonna try and see if I can have one." I'm like, "No, no, no. You are having a VBAC. Change
yeah.
the language."
Yeah. And I think that was like such a key mindset piece.
Mhm.
And like, from the moment I took the pregnancy test and I was pregnant, I was focusing on my mindset and I was
Yeah.
building a kick ass birth team.
Mhm.
At my first midwife appointment, I immediately started interviewing them basically about VBAC because I never had a VBAC. I don't know, are they a VBAC supportive group, like provider?
Yeah.
And in my first appointment, they did say, we 100% support VBAC, but VBAC, we need them to be in the hospital. And I kind of let it go at that time. And I was like, okay, that must just be a local policy.
Mhm.
And I let it like sit. I just wanted to like sit with that because in my mind, I knew I wanted a home birth. I
Yeah.
knew I did not want to step foot in a hospital. And at this point, I was doing everything I could. Like I was having chiropractor appointments. I was seeing an osteopath, and I made an appointment for pelvic floor physio.
Mhm.
And I feel like my pelvic floor physiotherapist is like such a key part of my birth journey. She's not like a trained doula, but she does attend birth. And
Okay.
she helped me to prepare my mindset and really work towards my goals of having a VBAC.
Mhm.
And I remember sitting with her in one of our appointments, and I was telling her the birth I was desiring and like everything I wanted it to be. And she looked at me and she's like, why are you not planning a home birth? And like, I didn't have an answer for her, but I went back to like, oh, well, the midwife said they support VBACs in the hospital.
Yeah.
And she's like, ask them again. And like this meeting, we were in my bedroom, which if you look out my bedroom window in the distance, you can literally like see the lights from the hospital. Like I
Mhm.
live very close to our hospital.
Yeah.
She's like, they should support a home birth because the hospital's 5 minutes away. And even
Mhm.
if it wasn't, they should still be supporting your home birth if that's what you want.
Yeah.
My next appointment, I went back to the midwife and I was so nervous to ask them. And I said, I've been doing a lot of research and preparation for my VBAC, and I want to give birth at home. Like, I know you guys said that you have VBACs in the hospital,
Mhm.
but like, it's not what I want. And they said, we will support whatever birth you want for your body. And she's like, if you have done the preparation and you know all the evidence based information around VBAC
Mhm.
and you've come to the decision that you want a home birth, we're having a home birth. And it was just such an instant like relief from my
Yeah.
body basically. And I was
Mhm.
instantly so excited to be planning a home birth. Later in my pregnancy, I guess the normal practice is to of the OBs is to let the OB, or sorry, the normal practice of the midwife is to let the OBs know when they're planning a VBAC
Mhm.
and to have a VBAC consultation with the OB.
Mhm.
But I declined it because my mindset was so focused and empowered, and I just knew that I was going to have a VBAC. I didn't want to sit in a room with that OB to have him try to like scare me out of it.
Mhm.
So I declined it. And then I was 38 weeks pregnant. And at that appointment with my midwife, they said, we're just going to send a letter to the OB letting him know that you're declining your OB consult. And I'm like, okay, great. And thank you for taking care of that for me so I don't have.
Mhm. Mhm.
The Saturday, when I was 39 weeks pregnant, I was at the park. I might have my timeline off. I'm not 100%. I was at the park with my husband and our toddler. It was like a beautiful summer Saturday morning. I was drinking my tea and I got a phone call from a local
Mhm.
number. I didn't know the number, but it was local to me, so I answered it. And it was the local OB calling
Mhm.
me regarding my plans for a home birth.
Mhm.
And I wish looking back that I just like hung up and said, sorry, I'm declining an OB consult.
Yeah.
But I was in such a I was I was so fired up about my home birth and like all this research that I just wanted to like prove him wrong. Like I just wanted to say everything I was doing to like prepare for this beautiful home birth and
Yeah.
like all this evidence-based information that like supports like HBACs and VBACs. Um and he at first he was like listening to me and he's like, okay, well, our hospital has a much lower C-section rate than the other hospital in town. And like at that moment, I realized that this OB hadn't even looked at my file. He didn't even know that he was the OB from my first birth that
Wow.
caused all my birth trauma.
Mhm.
He had no idea who I was, yet he felt confident to give me a 25% chance of having a successful VBAC.
Wow.
And I was just like, it just like blew my mind. Like, you haven't even looked at my file yet.
Mhm.
You're telling me that I need to be in the hospital, and that's what's best. So I I don't know why, but I kept trying to like give him more and more facts and information and stuff I was doing to prepare. And I
Yeah.
think he realized that he wasn't going to change my mind on having a home birth. Um, so he said, as a pure fear tactic, he said, if you continue with your plans for a home birth and your uterus explodes, you and your baby will die. And
Mhm.
like, that's like the hardest conversation of my whole life.
Yeah.
Like, it just like hurt my core. It hurt my
Mhm.
heart.
Yeah.
And I ended the conversation. And I knew it was just pure fear tactic.
Mhm.
But it's really hard to have someone say, like, if you are okay with this risk of you and your baby dying, go ahead with your home birth.
Mhm.
And to use such language as, like, your uterus exploding instead of saying like uterine rupture.
Yeah.
It's it was just so mean. It was so rude of him.
Mhm.
And thankfully, I had my birth team, like my little birth village of supporters. I didn't tell any friends or family that I was planning a home birth because I didn't want people's opinions. I
Yeah.
knew I was having a home birth. So I had my midwife, I had my pelvic floor physiotherapist, my husband, and like thankfully I did for that moment
Mhm.
because that conversation was hard.
Yeah.
And it did bring in a bit of doubt.
Mhm.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's something that I don't understand. I cannot wrap my mind around why any OB or any person in general would think it's okay to tell a woman that their baby could die based off the choices that they're picking. I
Yeah.
I don't understand where that started and was in everyone's head was, "Okay, that's fine, you could say that to people." Because that's
Yeah.
not something you should say at all. For any other surgery, there's risks, and they never once tell anybody, "Oh, but you could die. Like,
I
you
know.
could die from the surgery." They don't say that. They
They
say,
don't
"Oh,
even say that with C-sections or Pitocin.
yeah,
If a
for
VBAC
anything."
mom goes for an induction, that
Mhm.
increases your risk of uterine rupture.
Yeah. And they never use that for those cases where it's perfectly fine on their end and that's what they want. But when it's your choice and you're going against them, they think it's perfectly fine to say that and use that card, which is absolutely horrible and should never be said to a pregnant woman ever.
Yeah. So I feel like he really wanted to like instill fear in me, but it
Yeah.
definitely had the opposite. I am a very stubborn person and I just wanted to prove him wrong. I
Yeah.
just wanted to have my HBAC at home and have that experience that I missed out on my first birth.
Yeah.
And then I had to do like a lot of meditation with that and like a lot of just internal work to like reset my mindset. Because
Mhm.
when I got that phone call, I forgot to mention I was having contractions and
Um,
those contractions stopped. Like it
mhm.
was like my body knew we can't do this today.
Yeah.
We need to like recenter. We're feeling threatened. Let's
Yeah.
just like stop this.
Mhm.
So 3 days after that conversation, I was still working at this point because I assumed again that I would go overdue
Yeah.
because I did in my first birth.
Mhm.
So I finished my working day. I went to pick up my son from daycare, and in my car, I had a contraction, and I was like, "That's just a Braxton Hicks. Like I've been having them my whole pregnancy.
Mhm.
We're gonna ignore it." So I picked up my son, came home, had dinner, walked to the park, had a normal evening as our family of three, and we put our toddler to bed. And I noticed that I was still having contractions, but in my mind, I'm like, I'm ignoring these. They're Braxton Hicks. It's way too early for the baby to be coming.
Yeah.
So I was getting ready for bed, and my husband was like, "Do you think we should touch base with the midwife before you go to sleep?" And I was like, "No, it's just Braxton Hicks. I'm just gonna go to bed and they're gonna go away." And he's like, "You realize you're having contractions 3 minutes apart and they're
Oh.
lasting a minute." Because he was timing them without me knowing. So he ended up calling our midwife, even though I was still in 100% denial. I'm like, "This
Mhm.
is Braxton Hicks. They are not painful. I'm not barely noticing them. So I don't think we need to call her, but if it'll bring you comfort tonight, okay, call her." So
Mhm.
we called our midwife and he told her what was going on. And she's like, "Can I talk to Jessica?" And I was talking to her and like I would literally just, like, stop talking for a contraction, then just immediately pick up where I left off, like, I was really unfazed by them, and
Yeah.
she's like, "You sound fine, but I know that things change so quickly that I would just feel more comfortable just coming to check in on you in person."
Mhm.
So I agreed to having her come. She got to our house, and I like having information, so I agreed to a cervical check.
Mhm.
Because if I was only a few centimeters dilated, I was going to bed. And I just like in my mind, I assumed I was going to bed and I just didn't want my husband or my midwife to worry.
Yeah.
So she did a cervical check and I was 8, almost 9 centimeters dilated.
Wow.
And she like excitedly said, like, we're having a baby tonight. Like you are in labor. And
Mhm.
like it didn't even fully set in. I was like, whoa, 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 no. I can't be in labor. I'm not in pain.
You're like, "These were just Braxton Hicks, what are you talking about?"
Yeah. And, like, my body and my mind, like, remembering, like, the induced contractions from the hospital that are, like, double peaking.
Mhm.
I'm like, there's no way I'm that far progressed. And I remember, like, going to the hospital, or going not hospital, oh my goodness. I remember going to our bathroom and I was braiding my hair, and me and
Mhm.
my husband were just, like, laughing and, like, loving on each other. And my midwife was just like sitting on her bed in the other room, leaving us together.
Yeah.
Um, I had some anxiety creep into my labor because our son was at home and it was kind of just holding, I think it was kind of like a bit of a blocker because I did have a fear of a hospital transfer.
Mhm.
So my husband called my mom to come and pick up our toddler. Um, and she didn't know we were having a home birth. So she came assuming she was gonna go and, like, sleep in our guest room and, like, wake up the next morning with my toddler. And my husband basically, like, met her at the door with our toddler and said, "No, like, he's going with you, like, we're having a home birth."
Yeah.
And she was obviously, like, shocked because I think my friends and family assumed I would have a repeat C-section because that's what we knew.
Yeah.
Um, and after my son left, there was an immediate shift in my labor. I went to our bed and I was kind of like kneeling beside our bed, like swaying my hips. And I agreed to another cervical check out of curiosity and I was fully complete. But in my first birth, being told that I was 10 centimeters and needing to push, I never felt like I needed to push.
Mhm.
So I didn't want to push just because of that fact. I knew I wanted to wait for my body to be fully ready or to just do it itself, basically.
Yeah.
So I waited. The second backup midwife came because they like to have two midwives at a home birth in our local community. And I was just laying on our bed, breathing through my contractions, having an ice pack on my face. And I made like a really like guttural noise. And my midwife looked at my husband and she was like, "That's what we want."
Mhm.
And my body pushed my baby out, which was just amazing. Like to experience your body just knowing what to do and
Mhm.
trusting it fully and not having to figure out how to push or where to push or when to push.
Yeah.
It was so magical and peaceful. And my son was born at 3:21 a.m. at home. It was perfect. um, it was just night and day. Sorry, it was just night and day different from my first birth, and
Mhm.
the birth high was so so amazing. Like I felt so empowered. I felt so strong, and it just really, like, blew my mind that I just had a baby at home,
Mhm.
and, like, I couldn't wait to tell everyone and anyone who would, like, listen
Yeah.
to my birth story.
Mhm.
And also, like, my favorite part about home birth is having your midwives just, like, tuck you into bed just before they're ready to leave, and you're just there, like, with your husband, like, cuddling your newborn baby.
Yeah.
I remember, like, the sun rising, and it was August, so it was, like, warm and beautiful and, like, the most beautiful sunrise ever.
Yeah.
And that birth high, like, lasted a long time. Like, I felt so empowered. It really helped restore that mind-body connection.
Yeah.
About 6 months postpartum, though, when that birth high had settled, I did get hit with a lot of anxiety and depression over my first birth. I think really having those 2 like, 2 very different births and realizing what I didn't have in my first birth.
Mhm.
Like, I didn't hear his first cry. I didn't have him immediately put on my chest.
Yeah.
I didn't do skin to skin for, like, a few hours after postpartum. Like, I feel like I just didn't enjoy his or didn't get to enjoy his newborn fresh newborn thing.
Yeah.
And that's when I finally sought therapy for my birth trauma and anxiety and depression, and it was a lot to work through.
Mhm.
It brought up a lot of grief over my first birth,
Yeah.
and then during that time, when I was 13 months postpartum, my grandmother passed away. She was on palliative care for a week because we knew she was going to be leaving us. She was in her 90s. I think she was 96 years old. And I remember I was sitting with her, um, and I was reading her an article that was written about her and my grandpa
Mhm.
about their 70th wedding anniversary in our local newspaper. And I
Oh.
was reading like her words about like how she met my grandpa and like their marriage. And I played her favorite song, and I just like let her know like grandpa's waiting for you. I think it's your time to go.
Mhm.
And she passed away that night. And I
Wow.
feel like I don't know, I felt so connected to her,
Mhm.
and I really treasured that moment with her and just like letting her pass so peacefully. And about a month after she passed, obviously I was still grieving her loss. I realized I hadn't had my period in 2 months,
Mm.
which wasn't uncommon for me because I have PCOS. And like in the past, I've had fertility struggles. So I was like, it's probably just no period from PCOS. But I took a pregnancy test and I was pregnant. And I had no idea how far along I was.
Mhm.
So I made an appointment with our midwife. And I think my first appointment, I said, like, I'm either 4 weeks pregnant or like 10 weeks or 12 weeks pregnant. Like, I have no idea. So we opted for a dating ultrasound. And I was 8 weeks pregnant. And my
Mhm.
due date was my grandmother's birthday.
Oh my goodness.
And like, after having like fertility struggles and feel like it was like a gift from her. And I went to my second midwife appointment, and I was so excited because it was our midwife from our second birth.
Mm.
And I was so excited to plan another birth with her.
Yeah.
And that pregnancy was good. Like I felt great. It was uncomplicated. I declined an OB consult and an OB letter. I didn't want him to have any information about me. And it was just I was so happy to be pregnant again. Like, I've always wanted a large family.
Yeah.
And I was planning, obviously, my second home birth. This pregnancy was, like, slightly different because my first or my second pregnancy when I was planning a home birth, I didn't tell anybody. Nobody
Yeah.
knew. So
Mhm.
nobody talked about it. But
Yeah.
obviously, my third, everybody knew I was planning another home birth.
Mhm.
And, like, I don't know why, but people just have such a fear around home birth.
Mhm.
I'm sure it's our culture around birth. And I tried my best just to, like, ignore people's opinions because I didn't, again, want their fear to creep into my mindset.
Yeah.
I did have a lot of anxiety during this pregnancy because I was still working through my birth trauma and I was still grieving my first birth, grieving my grandma.
Yeah.
When I went into labor with my third, well, actually, I think my whole third trimester, I thought I was going into labor weekly. Like, I remember at 35 weeks, I was having contractions and I called our midwife and we tried to get them to stop like all day, but couldn't get them to stop.
Mhm.
She's like, "I think we should go into the hospital just to see what's going on." So I agreed. The moment, like, I got to the hospital, she, like, hooked me up to the monitor. I think I had 1 contraction and then they stopped. Like, I think my body just sensed the environment, was like, "We do not have births in hospitals. This isn't happening."
Yeah.
So it stopped, thankfully, and I went home and continued to be pregnant. At, um, 39 weeks and some days, my favorite midwife from my second birth was on vacation, and again, was having some contractions, and then I thought my water was leaking.
Mhm.
I wasn't sure. So I paged our midwife group, and the page was answered by a midwife I didn't know, which instantly kind of brought up the anxiety from my first birth of having a midwife I didn't know.
Mhm.
But I agreed to have her come and check to see if it was my water leaking. She got to my house, and I think the first thing I said was, "I'm sure you are a great midwife, but I'm having a lot of anxiety around you being here." And I told her about my first birth experience and how I had an unknown midwife to me. She let me know her history as a midwife, and she let me know that she was a nurse previous to being a midwife. And like most people, I'm sure that would bring comfort too. But having a nurse be a big part of my birth trauma with my first birth,
Mhm.
it kind of did the opposite for me. Like, I know she's a great midwife. I have friends who have had her as their midwife, but I knew she wasn't the midwife for me.
Yeah.
Thankfully, my water was not leaking. So she gave me some of the little test strips that they use to keep on hand in case any more fluid came out to test. And she left. And I continued to be pregnant. I feel like with all these like false labor starts, I thought I was gonna be pregnant forever.
Mhm.
At 39 weeks and 5 days, I was having contractions for a few hours. Decided to page my midwife from my second birth. She came with a newer midwife as well who I knew, and I had contractions for a little bit when they were there, and then they completely stopped again. My baby wasn't in the ideal position. He was kind of lying more towards my side,
Mhm.
and he just kept like wiggling out of position. So she she said, "Do you want? You have two options. We could do some things to try and get baby engaged again to get contractions to start. We could do like the mile circuit. We could walk the stairs, go for a curb walk, or you can rest and go to sleep."
Mhm.
I opted for rest because I didn't want to force my body to do anything that it wasn't ready for. So my midwife left, my husband and I went to bed. And then at 39 weeks and 6 days, it was a Sunday morning. I was sleeping in upstairs and my husband was downstairs playing with our 2 boys, and my water broke.
Mhm.
And I remember being so excited. I texted my midwife and I texted my pelvic floor physiotherapist because she was gonna be attending my birth. And I think I wrote, like, in capital letters, like, "My water broke!" Exclamation mark. Like, "We're having a baby today." Like, I was so excited. And labor started strong. Like, I remember trying to just ignore it. I wanted to make some soup, like, put some soup in the slow cooker,
Mhm.
um, and just, like, let it progress, but it started hard.
Yeah.
I went to our shower to just get some relief with, like, the water on my back, and that worked for a while, and our midwife arrived. I knew I was hitting transition, so I remember I was sitting on a yoga ball towards our bed, and I started a text to my pelvic floor physio, Robin, and I was like, "I think I need you to come, like, I need your support." But I
Mhm.
couldn't finish the text, like, my husband had to send it because my contractions, I swear they were double peaking,
Mhm.
and it was bringing in a lot of anxiety from my first birth because my water had broke, and now I'm having these contractions that I didn't have in my second birth.
Mhm.
When my physiotherapist arrived, like, I feel like her energy was just what I needed. Like, she instantly started counter pressure on my hip. She brought ice, for, like, them to soak washcloths to put cold ice on my forehead. She was such a huge support during that difficult hour or so. I knew that I just wanted to let my body be, and I did. I waited for my body to give me the signal that it was getting ready. I ended up laying down on our bed because that's what felt right in that moment. I had like an ice pack over my eyes and I just like went internal, like went to my birth space.
Mhm.
And my body pushed 3 times and my baby was born.
Wow.
And it was amazing. Again, just being, like, surrounded by people who 100% you trust and support you and your body is so comforting.
Mhm.
After that birth, I ended up having a postpartum hemorrhage, but my team handled it beautifully, and they kept me informed the whole time. They
Mhm.
let me know what was happening. They let me know the steps they were gonna take to stop it, the, like, medications that we would give if needed.
Yeah.
They let me know why they were doing, like, the fundal massages to get my uterus to contract. They ended up finding, like, a really small piece of, like, retained placenta, which was
Mm.
maybe the source of the postpartum hemorrhage,
Yeah.
and eventually they got it to stop. And I remember thinking in the moment, like, "Thank goodness that I have the team that I do," because other people, this would have been a hospital transfer, or if I was in the hospital, they would have just opted for a blood transfusion,
Mhm.
or who knows what else. And I remember postpartum telling my birth story and like casually saying I had a postpartum hemorrhage, and people being like, "Oh my gosh, that must have been so traumatic. Are you
Mhm.
okay?" And I was like, "It wasn't. There was no
Mhm.
trauma there." And I was like, nobody ever asked me after my C-section if it was traumatic.
Yeah.
Nobody. But after a home birth with a postpartum hemorrhage, I think I had 2 or 3 people ask me if it was traumatic.
Wow.
And just being able to tell them, like, no, like, I trusted the care of my team and they reassured me that it was going to be okay.
Mhm.
It wasn't traumatic.
Yeah.
So it's just like night and day difference between hospital care and home birth care.
Absolutely. That's incredible. I absolutely love your stories and
Thank you.
how redemptive both of your home births were.
Yeah,
Um, I feel like usually people get their like one redemptive home birth, and then after that, they just keep having home births, but they don't seem as redemptive as the first one. They're still like empowering and they're still amazing
yeah,
experiences. But I feel like you really got to experience two redemptive home births because you were still processing that
yeah.
first birth when you were going through your third pregnancy. So it was really
Right.
like two redemptive experiences. So that's really amazing.
Yeah, I always feel like my second birth, I wanted it to be the healing birth, but it was
Mhm.
my empowering birth. It was my restoring my trust in my body.
Yeah.
And then my third birth was really the healing of my first birth, especially because it had so many overlapping features.
Yeah.
Both my first and my third birth, my water broke to start my labor. I had really hard contractions.
Mhm.
Even both of those babies, their cords were wrapped around their neck.
Mm.
So, like, as a part of my C-section, the OB was like, "Thank goodness we did a C-section. The baby's cord was around their neck."
Yeah.
Versus my home birth, it was like my midwife just took the cord off.
Yeah.
So it's
Mhm.
just like my third birth was like really my birth trauma healing birth,
Mm.
and also all the work I did through therapy and energy healing, and just I was in the space to finally heal that birth trauma.
And I think that's a really big part too of why you did get to have a healing birth for your third is because you did go to therapy. And there's, I think, a big stigma about going to therapy and like it kind of saying that you're not powerful enough or you're not strong enough. And a lot of people have that mindset of that's what it means if you go to therapy, but it's not true. Therapy is so helpful, even for people who don't go through trauma or like a traumatic birth. I would say, even for mine, like my first hospital birth, it wasn't traumatic at all, but I definitely could have used therapy to go through everything that like happened at my birth. And it would have been so helpful. I never did it just because I didn't feel like I needed it because, like I said, it wasn't traumatic. But yeah, therapy is something that especially people with birth trauma should definitely take advantage of and use.
Yeah, and I think also, like, it takes a lot of strength to go to therapy. It's much
Mhm.
easier to just keep all those emotions in a neat little box that you ignore
Yeah.
and not process them.
Mhm.
And my biggest advice with therapy also is, like, find the right therapist. I
Mhm.
I saw a few different therapists before I found the right one that I 100% connected with.
Yeah.
I in the past, like, I would always start therapy, like, do a couple sessions and then stop.
Mhm.
But, like, when I finally found the right therapist, like, I've been seeing her since I was, like, 6 months postpartum with my second, and I
Mhm.
still see her.
Yeah.
And it really helps, especially when processing and continuing to process because I still get triggered
Yeah.
occasionally. And it's really important to find the right person for you. There's so
Mhm.
many different therapy options, therapy styles, social workers. Like, there's so many different options for people that you
Yeah.
really find the right one
Mhm.
if that's something that you want to do.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your stories. It was just so amazing to hear everything that you were able to accomplish because you were so determined and did all of the planning that you needed to and preparation. So, yeah, it was really amazing to hear those stories. So, thank you.
Thanks for letting me share them. Like, I feel like I could talk about birth all day.
Mhm.
And I just love sharing them. And, like, even in preparation for this podcast, I, like, wrote out my birth stories just so I could,
Mhm.
like, refresh my memory, and I'd never done that before, and it was so
Uh,
healing
mhm.
to, like, literally put the stories on paper and write it
Yeah.
out. It was beautiful. So I really appreciate what you're doing, letting people share their stories.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Wow. I just want to say thank you to Jessica again for sharing those really vulnerable birth stories with us. She is just so strong for being able to share all of that with us to hopefully help other women maybe not go through the same thing that she did with her first. If you would like to connect with her, you can find her on Instagram at the VBAC Mom. I will go ahead and leave her link down below so you can go ahead and connect with her. I love that she was able to kind of tackle all of her trauma that she had from her first birth and get some assistance with that as well from an outside source. I definitely think it does help to do birth story processing or birth trauma therapy, any outlet that lets you kind of process everything that you went through can be so, so helpful, especially for any future birth experiences. It will just help tremendously. If you are someone who feels like you do need to go through some birth story processing at all, that is something that I do offer. It is a virtual consult and it's one on one, so it's private, and you would just book that consult with me. It is an hour long, which usually is how long birth stories are, anyways. So that should be more than enough time. I will go ahead and leave the link to book a private consultation with me down below. And when you schedule in the notes, you would just add that it is for a birth story processing. This, like I said, is something that is private, so it is not considered a podcast interview like these ones where we are sharing them out with the public. The ones where we're actually processing the birth story are going to be kept private only between us, and it's more of going through the entire birth and picking out little things and evaluating it and processing any fears that you have from them, any grief, all of that, just to kind of make you feel a little bit better about everything that happened and be able to get over those fears from that first birth for your future birth experiences. If you are currently planning and preparing for a home birth, then let me tell you about the Home Birth Hub. It is a membership, and when you join, you gain access to live educational workshops, Q&A sessions, birth and mother circles, private community chats, my entire resource library, and so much more. To become a member, click the link down in the show notes and join us over at the Home Birth Hub. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love if you would share with any family or friends who may also benefit from these stories. Also, don't forget to leave a 5-star rating and review to help others find this podcast. Tune in next week for another amazing home birth story. Bye!